Welcome to the NPR Network and the Boas podcast with your hosts Keith McPeak, Rob Stone, and myself, Warren Booth. On today's show, we will be talking about two species of the genus Chilobothris, the Jamaican boa and the Puerto Rican boa. We hope you enjoy it. Things are good. Just crazy. It seems so long since we did our last show.
Yeah, it's been a while.
We've all
holidays and moving and all kinds of things going on.
You've been to Australia, right? I've been to Costa Rica. You know, it's and then moving. Yeah, it's been kind of crazy.
Yeah. Rob put us on another great adventure to Australia, so everything went on the back burner to get ready for that and enjoy that trip for sure.
So, Rob, you were there as well? You both went?
Yeah, 100%. Yep, we went, and Eric came, as did Matt Minatola and Teresa McPeak.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So how long was the trip for?
Pretty fun time. Yeah, no doubt.
How long
we were there for 7 days.
Oh, that's short.
Yeah. That's what we usually do in terms of our time frame, just to try and max it out for that window. It's hard for Eric, especially, to get off for longer than that. Yeah. And you lose 2 days in the process, so that it's realistically you're gone 9 or 10 days to be there for 7.
So you guys went in October, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think I was in the airport as well, going to London for
we were texting. Yeah,
we were texting back and forth. That's right. Very good. That's awesome.
Yeah,
very cool.
A good time.
Yeah.
So the move for you, Warren, that's a pretty big life-changing event right there.
You know, it's been in the works for, I think, I was first contacted by Virginia Tech in October 2021 about my interest in this position. And then interviews happened in December, and then January or February, and then another trip in April. And since then, it's kind of been, I've known it's happening. But I negotiated with Virginia Tech and with my former university to stay for an extra semester, just to help out, because they were screwed for teaching. And I figured that if I left, then they would have been in a lot of trouble, just because of a reduced number of faculty and students needing classes. So that helped. And staying back in Tulsa helped out with my family as well. You know, I wasn't going to be gone for an entire year, these trips back and forward. But that all came to an end. My last day at the University of Tulsa was Christmas Eve. My first day at Virginia Tech was Christmas Day. And then I got here last Wednesday evening. So I don't even know what date that was. But I'm here for like 10 days to 2 weeks at a time. And then I'll drive back to Tulsa and spend the rest of the month back there. And then I'll flip-flop between here in Tulsa for each month until end of May, June, whenever our house should be finished being built.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be moving my snakes up to a friend's place in Knoxville in March, or most of my snakes, not all of them. And then, I think selling a house without 120 snakes in it is probably a lot easier than, I'll have some of them in the basement that I will disguise as moving boxes and stuff like that there.
Right.
But other than that, it's great. It's Blacksburg, Virginia is just a beautiful place, so I'm really excited to be back on the East Coast. I've missed it, having lived in Raleigh, North Carolina for nearly 7 years. I'm really glad to be back here.
Where's that located in Virginia? Are you near the coast? Are you inland?
Oh, no, it's inland. It's right in the western, it's in the Shenandoah Valley.
Yeah.
So it's about 2,000 feet elevation.
Oh, nice.
But you're right. You're close to the Blue Ridge Parkway, not far from it. Wow. It's just beautiful. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Nice. Big change.
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
So obviously you're not pairing. You're not crazy enough to pair anything this year, are you?
Well, I said that I wasn't going to. And then I thought, I could put this trio of emeralds together. And then I thought I could put this pair of Trinidad Richenbergeri together, and a pair of Brazilian rainbows, and a pair of Hog Islands, and some Costa Rican T positives. There are more than I thought I would pair. I thought maybe one or two, but I put a bunch together, not expecting them to do anything. Right. But I think that's what we all think, right? We don't expect anything to do anything, but
that's usually when we have our best year.
Yeah. So my friend could be inundated by stuff, or not at all. You know, it'd be nice to see some more Hog Island boas. It'd be nice to have some more Brazilian. Yeah. And if the emeralds do anything, you know, these are I put my anaconda phase group together.
Oh, nice.
I just put the male in and the two females in together in a large enclosure. So we'll see what happens, you know.
Oh, good.
And a pair of Trinidad Trebos together just because they're kind of cool. So
yeah, we need more of them in the hobby.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we just had another litter a couple of months ago. So, you know, that's, I don't know how many, that's maybe 5 litters we've had, 4 or 5 litters we've had in the last few years, you know. So we're getting to the point now where we're going to start distributing them to zoos.
Good stuff.
And then after that, we can see where we go. So
yeah, good.
Yeah, really cool.
Rob, you've been quiet on social media and our little private chat groups, and also you must be super busy at the moment.
Yeah, just all the usual things, and you know, between that and the holidays and all that, it's as ever, it's just keep you busy, but all good things, and it's I'm certainly happy to listen to all the fun stuff that you guys have going. So.
Are you doing any pairing this year?
Maybe one Solomon Island tree boa female looks pretty good. The one that I bred previously looks like she's thinking about it. And then we'll, you know, heading into the season, we'll probably do the Jamaican boa again, which would be cool and is certainly topical for tonight. But and then, you know, rhino rats presumably as well. But that'll be about it.
Nice, good.
How about you, Keith?
I've been concentrating a lot on family this year, but the last couple of months with the holidays and all that. But I think I do have a lot of pairings going on, but I'm really concentrating on trying to upgrade all my enclosures for the animals. And I like to build my own stuff. So for Christmas, I asked for a lot of tools to make the job easier, which I got. So now I got a lot of projects on hand. I have a lot of ideas for different enclosures and setting things up a little bit different. So that's kind of my goal, but I do have some good stuff going on. Looking forward to, right now I have a Argentine boa that looks very promising, and it's been a very long time since I've produced those. So this will be almost like a first for me again.
Very cool.
And it's Eugene Bissette's line. So they're really nice animals, and excited to hopefully get a litter of those this year. Now I'm doing the Sanzinia again, a bunch of other little things, but definitely excited about the Argentines.
I love the fact that you are excited about the Argentines and you just kind of bypass the Sanzinia just like that, you know.
I actually have I have 2 females, and the males have been breeding them pretty consistently. And the one female, she's showing a lot of promising signs, but I'm used to I know there's some lines of Sanzinia females that don't really darken hormonally when they get gravid or once they ovulate. So I don't see any color change in this girl. So I'm kind of like on the fence about her, but she's thick and she's hard and she's swelled up. So I still have hope for her. And then I have the big female that dropped for me 2 years ago. So she's been being bred, and things are looking good for her. So might get 2 litters this year. We'll see.
So are these both Easterns or Westerns or one of each?
I only work with the Easterns now. I don't have any of the Westerns.
Yeah. Awesome. That's fantastic. You know.
Yeah. I'm excited about that. It's just that it's the Argentines I just haven't done for so long, you know. So like I say, it's very exciting to kind of go through that again.
What about Corrales? Are you pairing any Corrales?
I have a pair of, you know, quote unquote new locale northerns that I have together. And other than that, I think that's the only pair I'm going to put together for the emeralds. I did put my Costa Rican Rauschenberger eye together. I had a lot of breeding there, so we'll see how the female goes. And that's really it for the corrals this year, I think.
Yeah, that's cool. That's awesome.
Yeah, I'd like to get a nice, big, viable litter of the Rauschenberger eye. I'll have, a decent amount of stillborns in every litter that I've had. And, I'll have 6 to 9 viable babies, But I'd like to get a nice litter. I think you've had up to 15 babies, haven't you?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I can't remember how many I had in the last one, whether it was 13 or something like that there. And no stillborn and no slugs.
Yeah.
And yet, from that same female, 2 years prior, it was the same thing that you had, right? She dropped 2 or 3 babies, slugs, and then a week later, she dropped 5 or 6 babies and 5 or 6 stillborn.
Mm-hmm.
So that was that first year was weird. This year is different, and I'm trying to think what was different between those two. The first year that I had her, that she bred, she was in a large exoterra with a ceramic heating element, and the basking sites were great. And that happened, and then I moved them into these new enclosures, and they're all radiant heat panels and UV lights, and it was a perfect litter. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. It was just weird, the fact that both you and I that same year we had these weird occurrences of produce some and then a big break and then produce more.
Yeah, it was very strange. That's one of the first for me with them. I've had live, bearing animals where they'll drop a baby maybe hours before, but there was days in between. It was just strange.
I think mine was 5 days because I remember it happening and I thought, wow, for a 7-foot female to produce 5 babies and a slug, I thought that's weird because I've had 6 feet Amazon tree boas producing 25 babies.
Yeah.
So it was just unusual. And then, of course, a few days later, she dumped the rest, But this year last year, she was great. And all those babies, apart from one, they all did really well.
Mm-hmm.
They started on, some of them I got going on fluff mice that were washed and then dipped in either chicken broth or used one of the scent, the lizard scent or the animal scent or the frog scent. But most of them, I would put a bunch of pink rats into a bag, set it on a heat mat, get them nice and juicy, and offer at night, and they just went mad for them.
Yeah.
So they were really easy to get feeding this year.
Yeah, it's nice when you get a litter like that.
Yeah. So they were great. The emeralds that I had earlier this year were all the same as well. So they all but one have gone. I've got one left to go. It's going to get shipped whenever I get back or whenever the weather's good.
Nice.
And the Sonoran boas that I produced, they've all gone as well. So it was a really good year I didn't produce a lot, but I was really happy with what I did produce.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, well, so on tonight's topic, I've been looking at my Jamaican boas, Rob, and I'm trying to gauge their size and structure and all too when I had visited you and you were doing some last-minute cleaning before we did our first trip to Australia. And I'm trying to gauge, I think mine are probably in the size range of what those animals were then. So I'm hoping maybe in another year, I would say, they'll be ready to give a shot. So tonight's show's got me very excited because you're the guy. This is your wheelhouse. So I'm interested to pick up some tidbits from you tonight.
And this is something that's totally foreign to me. I've been offered Jamaican boas a couple of times. I've never taken them. I will once I get relocated. So this is going to be an interesting one for me. So in the last few shows where I've been talking a lot, this time you're going to hear me talking very little. Everybody will appreciate.
So, Rob, if you're ready, let's get into it, man.
Awesome. Well, step one, I appreciate the compliment there, Keith, but I would say that, I've learned so much from Jeff Murray in particular. He and Michael Sena have put together the website westindianboas.org, and it's just an incredible resource in terms of all the West Indian species There's a ton of referential literature. We're going to cite a lot of things that come from there, so I want to be clear with that off the top. It's truly as a resource, westindianboas.org is unmatched in terms of compilation of all these different things, including a lot of published material and things like that that are synthesized or presented there, as within the ability to do so. So it's truly fantastic.
Yeah.
That being said, the genus Cheilobothris contains 14 species, including 2 that have been described in the last 6 years: Argentum, the Conception Island boa, and Ampelophus, the Hispaniolan vine boa, which was described in 2021. Cheilobothris are a monophyletic group of boas dating to the Miocene, 23 to 5.33 million years ago, and they're most closely related to the anacondas of the genus Eunectes. Cheilobothris was initially established as a genus in 1844 to describe or contain the Puerto Rican boa, though both it and the Jamaican boa were reassigned to Epicrides in 1893. Reynolds et al. In 2013, and I think that's someone that Warren has done work with, resurrected Cheilobothris. The genus name Cheilobothris means a lip without pits and is a reference to the absence of labial heat pits. Though the phylogeny it presented is no longer accepted, a uniquely interesting analysis was conducted by Peter Tolson, 1987, that included the morphological characteristics of skin lipids and scent gland lipids. These traits influence reproduction, species recognition, and water retention, and as Jeff Murray and Michael Santa point out, the role of these characteristics in ecological niche fitness and speciation is really super interesting, and is really of note with these species. If you think about both Jamaican and especially Puerto Rican boas, they were historically harvested for their fats, right, to be both consumed and burned. So that was a big part of their original sort of human use. So super interesting stuff there, and not something, I don't think I've seen that really anywhere else. So it's kind of unsurprising in the context of species that are well known to be muskers generally. I would say that that's a little bit overstated and overrated as reasons not to keep these. I think it just sort of fits a narrative within the hobby. But that being said, they definitely have the capacity to do it, and it's certainly something that then, if you view it that way as, okay, what can we learn in terms of a phylogeny or relationship amongst things based on the characteristics of such a strongly produced trait?
The fact that they were harvested for their fats, that's pretty remarkable.
That is remarkable.
Because they're not huge snakes, right? So, that's a pretty incredible.
Yeah, no, totally. That was thought to be sort of one of the, so both of these species are, and we'll come to this in terms of sort of availability and captivity later, but in terms of as species go, these are species that were both put on the Endangered Species Act in sort of the initial listings in the early 70s, and both had been, I would say both have faced human use issues human use or human interaction issues for the last several hundred years. And particularly in the context of Jamaican boas, as we'll come to, it definitely has had a strong impact on their populations. In terms of the Puerto Rican boas, I think maybe there was some sampling stuff that put them there. Certainly their populations had declined, but I think in terms of being perceived as so between vulnerable and endangered, a lot of that was probably overstated and represented either sampling error or maybe overstating the impacts of development, because particularly the Puerto Rican boas have shown to be very adaptable to urban environments, and like Facebook groups from Puerto Rico with wild reptiles and things, people will post all the time photos of Puerto Rican boas in urban environments.
Yeah, I equate them kind of like carpet pythons. Just from what I've seen on the internet, like you're saying, Rob, they always seem to take advantage of human habitats for rodents or whatever that are attracted to human establishments. And just from what I've seen, they remind me of carpet pythons in Australia.
So are they?
Yeah, I think that's totally right, Keith. Go ahead, Warren.
Go ahead. I was interrupting.
Yeah, I think that's totally right there, Keith. That's really how I sort of contextualize them in terms of both as a captive animal and their existence in the wild, and what they remind me of as a captive animal is really a coastal carpet python. Puerto Rican boas to me are very much a similar snake in terms of physiology, structure, how they've adapted to human habitation, and just sort of as a captive animal. So we'll hit into some of those things. I have a few notes here on both Jamaicans and Puerto Ricans, and then we can really get into it.
Yeah.
Jamaican boas were originally described in. Yeah, go ahead,
I was just
Warren.
going to ask one thing quickly. So these are restricted to single islands each, or are they found on, are they distributed more broadly and just called Jamaican boas or Puerto Rican boas, or are they restricted to the island of Jamaica and Puerto Rico?
Yeah, perfect. So Jamaican boas were originally distributed on Jamaica and a small island, Goat Island, off the coast there. It appears they've been extirpated from Goat Island, so they're just in Jamaica now. Historically, Jamaican boas were distributed throughout much of Jamaica based on the descriptions from the last several hundred years of literature. Today, they occur on less than 10% of the island across 20 isolated pockets. The largest contiguous habitat that seems to suit them is in what's called the Cockpit Country in Jamaica. A 2016 study on habitat use indicated several potential habitat types that are underused by Jamaican boas. It seems the preference or where they're found now is tall forests and areas with heavy canopy cover. This is thought to reflect anthropogenic or human pressure rather than actually species sort of capacity. They occur in banana plantations foraging for rodents, but are frequently killed by locals when they're encountered. So it seems like they essentially a lot of habitat that was historically suitable or would otherwise be suitable isn't suitable in Jamaica because there's a very strong prejudice against these snakes in Jamaica. It seems the majority of the pictures, there's one YouTube from Jamaica where the fellow will go and relocate these, and that seems to be sort of obviously the optimal situation, whereas most of the exposure is people killing them despite the fact they're in Endangered Species Act listed animal. There aren't any venomous snakes in Jamaica, so it really doesn't make sense that people are afraid of snakes in the way that they are. As we'll get into with food, they will go after captive chickens and their eggs, so you can see some negative exposure there, but for the answer to be killing an endangered species, just to kind of avoid that problem, seems a bit draconian, shall we say. In terms of the range of Puerto Rican boas, they're distributed widely, but only on the main island, to your point. So Puerto Rico has something like the main island and then 200 additional islands and cays that were connected not all that long ago, or at least some of which were connected not all that long ago, but somewhat surprisingly, they only occur on the main island. They occur in 62 of 83 municipalities in Puerto Rico. They occur in a wide variety of habitats, like we've talked about. Basically, for the most part, all of those that are present within the main island of Puerto Rico, including rainforest, karst landscape, caves, dense tropical deciduous forest, and, as we were talking about, altered environments, including urban areas. Let's see. So, other fun factoids. Jamaican boas were... go ahead, Keith.
I was just going to ask, it seems just from what you're telling me here that the Jamaican boas seem to be more adaptable to... are less adaptable to urbanization than the Puerto Rican boas?
That's sort of where the records are at this point, although I would say that it seems like that's probably not anything to do with the capacity of the snake or the conditions of the environments within their respective locations, as much as it is the attitude of locals to snakes generally in those areas. So and Jamaican boas could be more widespread, except that people kill them on site for the most part.
And to that point, is there a tremendous size difference in adults, or is there a more cryptic nature in one species versus the other that makes them more vulnerable to humans seeing them and killing them versus the other species, or are they pretty much kind of live the same kind of a lifestyle?
I think really it's just, I think unfortunately we're in the space where it's just the attitude in Jamaica is so different from the attitude in Puerto Rico in terms of how people interact with, at least these respective snakes. In Jamaica, it seems like the boas really are limited to areas where there are fewer people, and so there are fewer people encountering them. And that's, kind of puts us in that context of tall tropical forest with tall forest and canopy cover, so that those are areas that are not developed in the same way. The plantation stuff, you would think that there would be that feedback loop of they're consuming these rats that are going after the plantation crop, and they're providing that service. And again, being in such a strong space where there's no mistaking these for a venomous snake. There aren't venomous snakes there. I suppose it would be a right on my part to validate that. That's my belief, but I suppose just for the form of the thing, I'll validate that's true. But it's not a case of confusion; it's a case of prejudice.
Yeah. Well, some cultures also, it doesn't matter if you tell them they're not venomous or not harmful. They're just going to believe that they're harmful or venomous and can hurt you, no matter what you tell them. So. I believe that that's true. We're kind of, Google's giving us a mixed bag here of, I don't believe so. There's a suggestion of a adder known as a common viper, but most things don't agree with that, and certainly not dangerous to humans, and definitely wouldn't look like a Jamaican boa. And right.
I don't think that's even correct. It's just an expression of prejudice to human detriment, both in terms of the actual production of these things and rats are problematic to everyone. Yeah. So, and in terms of as a pest vector, so really doesn't make any sense. Just a couple of fun factoids in terms of the taxonomy associated with these. The Jamaican boas were originally described in 1725, prior to the introduction of the Linnaean binomial nomenclature system. They were redescribed in 1901, interestingly, using the species name subflavus, which was associated with the 1725 description, but the documentation didn't reference at all the fact that description was made in 1725. Subflavus is taken to mean yellow, blonde, or, quote, under yellow, flavus there, maybe referencing interstitial coloration. I don't know exactly what under yellow would mean. But, yeah, there's a bit of a taxonomy has always been fraught, let's say, in the sense that it's pretty intriguing that the same name would be utilized, but without reference to its source 175 years later, right? They would just happen to say, oh, yeah, we should use this somewhat oblique term to describe these. It just happens to coincide, but no reference to the fact that happened.
Yeah, I think part of it is that, in 1910 versus 17, whatever, there's no Google scholar. You can't turn around on Google and say, right, well, has somebody described this species yet or before or whatever? And therefore, for many...
Well, I'm just saying that I'm not sure that you would call it the same. To me, that's totally conceivable, and I accept that that's entirely possible. But I would suggest that the fact you would come to that same sort of combined non-singular Latin word as the species name description is just, I don't know, that's a heck of a coincidence. So it's entirely possible, and I definitely, am on board that point is true. I think, to your point, right, nowadays it's so easy for us to be aware of all the different things that are happening. We certainly saw it, but it's amazing to me in some ways that, as you say, like a description from 1865 and then another in 1870, the idea that, because the initial, as some taxonomists or people who consider themselves to be taxonomists nowadays utilize, right, in terms of the details of publication to formally put a name out into the space, those things represent conditions in the 1700s and 1800s. It's amazing to me in some instances that there even would be the capacity to have awareness of other things going on in the world at that time. And to your point, yeah, we definitely understate the realities of that impact. I just say this particular instance, it's weird to me that, or it would be very coincidental that you would get that commonality. So I think here maybe we're looking at someone not respecting the process in the sense of saying it wasn't done within the Linnaean system and structure. So kind of utilizing that work and to pull the epithet for the species name of subflavus, but not necessarily giving credit to that having happened before.
Interesting. So,
in terms of, go ahead, Keith.
No, I was just looking at some of the notes that you had given us. I didn't know if you were going to get into the feeding in the wild, because I find that very interesting. Yeah,
100%. Just as to close the loop, the Puerto Rican boa was described in 1843, as we talked about above. The next year it was put into, or the genus that they're presently in, Calabathris, was created to host that species. The species name inornatus means unadorned. As folks who've seen, either interacted with or seen photos of these, there is a range of presentation such that some have sort of a lighter background coloration with darker blotching. But some particularly older animals can appear almost unicolor, and that's, I would say it's an impolite but not entirely misstated scientific name there.
And Rob, didn't you say that these guys can actually change color somewhat also, depending on temperature, mood, whatever?
Yeah, they definitely can. Not quite as much as like a Candoia, where you see a strong day to night variation, but in terms of seasonally, and I would say it's more akin to an Irian or a Papuan carpet python, where you have a day to night sort of lightening and darkening. They definitely can appear lighter or darker, and on animals that show a pattern, it can thus appear more or less pronounced throughout the course of a season in particular. And they do, some of them, particularly gravid females, can get very dark, so that with their iridescent shine, they can, they're not quite a southern white-lipped python, but they can certainly give a strong black presentation.
Mm. Yeah, I remember finding a picture of one that was heavily patterned, and I sent it to you, and I'm like, Rob, if you ever have any that look like that, and you're like, well, just wait, because it'll look like that at some point during the day.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, no doubt. So, yeah, it's super, super interesting. The Jamaican boas don't seem to do that. They don't have a ton of range of variation. They will seemingly maybe have a little seasonal change in their color presentation, and maybe that's diet, right, a reflection of carotenoids and things. If we're adding those to feeders, which maybe brings us to feeding in the wild, and then we can get into captivity, and you both will, despite your experience or not with either of these species, you'll definitely have a lot of input and useful insight, because they really fit very neatly into the standard boa presentation. Wild Puerto Rican boas are opportunists that take rats, mice, and birds. The population at Cueva de los Culebrones is well known to congregate at the entrance to the cave to capture bats. There's been a lot of study around that. That particular cave is home to 6 species of bats with an estimated aggregate population of more than 300,000 bats at a given time. Additionally, recent observations have shown them constricting presumably for consumption, an iguana, wild subflavus. Hey, Keith, babe, we'll see what you make of this. So they principally eat rats and birds, including captive chickens and their eggs, but they also are known to eat black-billed and yellow-billed parrots and their eggs as a natural prey species. And juveniles will eat bats at caves.
I'm shocked that they'll
and
take
one
the
other
eggs.
Yeah, so one interesting thing on that, I think it was in the context of chickens. One was found that it had consumed a bunch of chicken eggs, and I don't remember if it had been killed or if they essentially palpated or regurgitation or what the circumstance was, but it had eaten 7 chicken eggs, all of which were still whole, which I obviously, in the context of pythons that eat eggs, I don't know if we usually then see in non-obligate egg feeders, right? They don't have the structure to pierce eggs, but I don't know if that's standard, sort of, as we talked about them being kind of both species similar in lifestyle to carpet pythons. If we have carpet pythons that'll eat, captive chickens or their eggs, if those are typically then kind of broken in the digestive process, if it's a reference to how thick the shells are, or if they're typically, I would think to get at the sort of nutritional capacity of that beyond sort of eating away at the calcium in the eggshell, at some point they have to deteriorate to be digested as opposed to just passing through. So maybe it just reflected them being fresh, but sort of an interesting point that they were swallowing them whole.
Yeah.
Have you ever tried feeding yours chicken eggs or quail eggs, or do you know anybody with captive animals that have tried to feed eggs?
I don't know, not really. And so the interesting thing I would say about Jamaican boas generally is that certainly compared to Puerto Ricans, they're in general a little bit more. They're not quite as aggro feeders, whereas Puerto Rican boas are just like a carpet python, where they're always ready to go, and their food drive is very high. Jamaican boas, on the other hand, seasonally have a very high food drive, but they tend to have stronger predilections in terms of wanting their food presented in a certain way, or to meaning to have a successful feed, to bite the rodent in the kind of right area on the face that promotes consumption, in the same way that I've really seen with Apodora and Gavin expressed to us in the context of Owen belly pythons, that they have there are just some species that are a little bit more, maybe they're less sure of themselves in terms of a feeding event, and they just sort of have predilections of they want to take it in a certain way. I would say that subflavus are, while not as extreme in those areas, in general are a little bit more specific in terms of how they like things. So I don't know. I just have a hard time imagining it can be challenging enough when they want to feed to get a really consistent feed into them. So it's hard to imagine them taking chicken eggs or quail eggs or anything kind of in that context.
Yeah.
Maybe if you set up a net, I guess that's how you could promote that.
Yeah. I know my pair, as I was raising them, you had kind of given me that heads up that that's how they can tend to be. And I know for sure, now they're different when it comes to feeding, but as I was raising them, I had to present the, same sized rat and place the pre-killed rat just before dark in the exact same spot on the exact same log, so that when the snake came out of the hide at night, its nose was right there, that it was the first thing that it came in contact to. If I placed that rat any other way inside that cage, it would still be there in the morning. But if I placed it in that same spot so that when it came out of its hide at night and it ran into that rat, it would eat it every time. It was the strangest thing. Now they've I've grown them up. Now I'm going to have to move them, which is kind of stressing me out. But I grew them up in a bigger cage, and I just packed that cage full of, they like a lot of hide and contact security, I find. So I just had that cage packed with a lot of hide spots pretty much throughout the whole cage. But now they're kind of outgrowing that cage, so I'm going to have to move them. So I'm curious to see how they settle in and feed and all. So right now they're in such a routine. It's not too much of a struggle to get them to feed. But I think when I move them, I could go through another learning curve with them as far as to keeping them consistent.
So I'm assuming as babies, they're probably lizard feeders?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and they're Anola species. And when we talk about breeding, I do have some thoughts on that I've kind of had based on my experience producing them in 2021, and kind of the experience of that litter and how that went. So we can, one last note, just in terms of being in the wild, that I did want to toss out there, because this was thought in addition to human interactions leading to decline in Jamaica. The mongoose was introduced to great detriment to wild Jamaican, the wild Jamaican environment overall. But a 1982 study did find evidence that a large Jamaican boa had consumed a mongoose. So
that's amazing.
Maybe at least on the large end, they can, kind of push back. So yeah, that was taken as a really positive sign.
Now, Rob, do you know why was the mongoose introduced for rats in farms and trying to subdue the rat population?
I think that's right. Yeah, and it kind of in the same way of a lot of historical introductions has gone poorly for the environment that wasn't prepared for them.
Yeah, meanwhile, they have the Jamaican boa that could do the job and unknowingly kill on sight.
Yeah. Yeah, not great. So in terms of, I don't think we really talked about the size on these. For the most part, the snout length, so for Puerto Rican boas, is generally about 6 feet for both males and females. In general, as they of the same age, females will be larger, particularly once they're mature. But yeah, going back to that point of kind of in the same vein as a coastal carpet, that's basically what we're looking at. And so somewhere in the 4 to 6 foot range in general, with a girth of probably 2 to 3 inches across, particularly on a larger female. And then obviously with age, and these, as with most boids, longevity records on these, we're talking, more than 2 decades, with animals still going at that time. Obviously, things can happen, but just as a general expectation, certainly teens to 20s is something that we're looking at, absent additional factors coming into play. Those animals can get larger. I know Tom Crutchfield has a couple really big ones that he keeps outside and things. So then that's in the context of the Jamaican boas. But in general, any sort of suitable boid cage makes sense. In terms of temperature, the natural exposure is kind of lows in the low 60s up through highs in the upper 80s or 90. So they really fit into sort of the standard boid typology. Both of them will exhibit arboreal behavior, particularly when they're smaller. If we're providing a context within the cage that'll support it, they, I think as long as they feel sure about it, with greater size, they'll still utilize those things. I think in captivity, that's something that we run into where we say that larger animals don't utilize arboreal areas as much in general, but that's probably a functionality of sort of confidence within the structures that we're putting into that environment. In my experience, they do really well in cork hides and flats that are set up to allow sort of not only do those textures give additional usable surface area within the cage, as opposed to the standard chondro approach or whatever. They are, I guess, as an additional point, they are more akin to annulated boas or Amazon boa termination, where they're going to look for multiple points of contact and generally sit rather than perching in a standard sort of emerald or green streak python sort of presentation.
I was going to ask that question because at the zoo in Tulsa, they've got some Jamaican boas, and they're always always in the trees, but they're thick branches. They're kind of logs that are kind of diagonally placed that are, 5, 6, 7 inches in diameter. So I've never seen them in all the times that I'm there. I've never seen them on the ground. So I was curious. I was going to ask that question. Are they more like my annulateds, the way I've got my annulates set up? They rarely are on branches. They're normally I put in these PVC tubes at different levels, and they're normally sitting in those or on top of those. So it sounds like they act very, very similar.
And that's my experience. It's super interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. They don't have that kind of laterally compressed body, but right. So that they don't have the same body structure as an annulated or an emerald, From the ones that I've seen, they're slightly more round. It's more, they sound exactly carpet python. They sound like the New World carpet python, basically.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. Keith, what's been your experience? I know you do some interesting things.
Yeah, so
with your setups.
Yeah, I use a lot of PVC actually in their cage, and then I also use standard hides. I like them weighted, but I do notice that they go to the dowel perches. I provide them definitely when they're hungry. They can be out on that perch during the day when they're hungry, and I can feed them at any time if they're on that perch, and they'll eat. If they're in their hide or in the PVC and I try to feed them, they're a little bit more reluctant to take the food. But if I see them up on those perches and I'm working in the room, they're game on. I can just barely get the rat in the cage, and they're taking it off the forceps. So definitely seem to me that they go to the arboreal state when they're hunting.
But they're not coiled up like an emerald. They're draped over it, kind of thing. Is that right?
Yeah, they're not. They're definitely. I don't notice them coiled up like the classic chondro emerald thing. I have a lot of, like you said, I put a lot of cross pieces in my dowels, and they definitely lay in a more loose coil. Again, I think they're hunting, so they're going to be more ready for action than a coiled up resting pose,
Yeah, 100%. Have you observed a lot of seasonal variation in their willingness to feed, Keith? I know that's something that it sort of defines my experience with them, even more so than the Puerto Rican boas. But then again, I am subjecting them to light cycling, temp and humidity cycling. I would food cycle them anyway, but certainly all those things kind of feed into, so they're all pushing in that direction. I know my room has a lot more volatility and fluctuation in temperature than yours does. So I'm curious if you see the same kind of stark seasonality and willingness to feed, or exhibiting that sort of behavior associated with feeding.
I don't, and actually that kind of has me concerned, because I know you've told me that in the past, how you see a seasonal, cycling of the feeding, where mine, it was more when they were young. Like I say, they were more picky and harder to get consistently feeding. But right now, for the last 10 months, I'm going to say, it's pretty much on feeding day. They're ready to feed, and they feed every time. Like even if they're going opaque, which when they were younger, even when they were going opaque, they would not touch anything at that time until they went through the shed. But now I notice they're pretty aggressively feeding. I don't know how long your cycles last, but I'm just saying for the last 10 months, mine have been on fire feeding. And I don't know, maybe once they totally mature, that'll come into play a little bit more. But I do have them in, where I have them in my back room, and I have the Corrales and Rauschenberger eye and everybody in there. So I do cycle that room. So they are going through a temperature drop at night and reduce daylight. I didn't intentionally do any food cycling with them, but they're definitely having a seasonal cycle happening to them in that back room, and they've actually been in that back room their whole life. So they've been doing it from day one up until now, getting that cycle in the winter.
And what's that low temperature get to in your room?
I go down in that room. I don't go below like 71, 72 at night.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think in the low point on mine will be in the lower 60s, like 63, 64, kind of on the very coldest nights. So a little bit stronger, but not. I will say that at sometimes I still, if that happens to coincide with them having a wild hair or whatever, that I will see them even still feed at that time. So it's more, I agree that I think yours in terms of that response you're getting now is probably a reflection of being in that they're out of the stage where they're more both in terms of the routine and the time that you've had them, but also having gotten a little bit more age, they tend to become better, more consistent feeders with that time. And when they're in that window, I have a few of them that are in that same window that yours are right now. And I will say that those have a less of a strong seasonality than either the adults or the smaller ones.
Yeah, I figured maybe it was coming as they get more sexually mature.
So what age are yours?
Yeah, so they might come with then time to...
Yeah.
What age are yours?
2019.
Okay.
Actually, 2018. I'm sorry, 2018.
Okay.
Yeah, to that point, Warren, relative to, I would say that in general, they are smaller than people would think. And I think it's mostly a reflection of the sort of the challenge to get them to eat consistently, whether it's a sort of the seasonality aspect or the just potential finickiness in terms of growing them up, combined with, I think people in general, I know certainly I would fall into this category, are careful with something that's so precious to them that, and their metabolism, kind of the nexus of all those things is that even at 4 or 5 years old, they're not as big as if they were a carpet python, right? In terms of, in general, if you look at most animals, I think people who haven't worked with them are always surprised by the size relative to age of most of the captive animals that people see.
What's their
metabolism? I don't think, it'll be interesting to, their growth relative to food input is not huge. It's not as slow as something like a Candoia, but it's also definitely not like a Corrales, right? That really responds in terms of growth to inputs that go in. So that in terms of getting to adult size and those sorts of things, it really is sort of a 5 or 6 year process on these for the most part, and you'll even be, I know what sort of the perpetual interaction that I see online and things with people, the new ones is these are 3 years old, and well, part of it is the size that they're born at, but yeah, the other is an expression of their lack of a burst response to feeding.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, like I find, and you're probably the same, the Corrales granadensis, they grow incredibly slowly. So I'm just curious about their, their wild diet and how that drives it. If they're, I haven't read any studies on these, so I don't know how much of their diet is composed of bats, for example. So bats realistically they're not that big for many of the species. So, there could be a very small intake frequently, but a low caloric intake that they're burning off pretty quickly to go and hunt for these things. And it just adds time to put any kind of growth on these animals. Pretty fascinating.
100%. And the one thing that raises in my mind that I hadn't thought to point out here is that particularly in the Puerto Rican boas that are more associated, particularly as adults, at least in their, those that are in a cave landscape, I find that Puerto Rican boas respond more consistently to smaller food items. So even on my adult Puerto Rican boas, I feed them weaned mice. So we're talking something, a 5-foot snake that's 2 or 3 inches across, but their response to a large hopper or weaned mouse is a lot stronger than even, a retired breeder mouse, just in terms of willingness to go for it. They're very responsive to small items, and I find I have more success feeding them an item a day, 3 or 4 days in a row, and then within the sort of the windows that they're eating. So if there's sort of a spring window, a spring window, and a fall window, I might be feeding them 70% of those nights that are within that window, and maybe the total mass consumed over the year wouldn't be strange to someone that was instead approaching them trying to feed them, a rat once a week across the entirety of the year. But the response to those small items, exactly in the vein you're talking about of kind of replicating the consistent consumption of small prey, even it's probably reflecting they're probably not going out every single night, but maybe 2 or 3 or 4 nights a week within that feeding season, which presumably also will then coincide with the real bat movement season, or especially those that are, right, in general, it's immature animals that are most likely to be caught in those sorts of mass aggregation or, mass entrance and exodus sort of situations. Probably we're really seeing that replication there. But
gorging in a short period of time on a lot of prey items that are small, and then probably persisting for a long period of time without much food as well. So,
I mean, from what I know from bats too,
definitely.
The parents, the mother will leave the young bats, on the cave ceiling, right, and they go out to hunt at night. So who's to say during that breeding season the boas aren't taking advantage of that food source, gobbling down 5 or 6 babies at a sitting?
It'll be interesting, with the new book coming out on the boas. Then it'll be interesting to see if Graham and Bob Henderson have actually got any chapters on feeding in the wild. If there's been any real studies on that, again, it's something I haven't looked into. But it's a pretty fascinating topic.
There's some cool stuff. They've because they occur at such densities. There's I know the herpetological highlights guys on the front end of their podcast. So I think it was episode 3 or 4 talked about a paper that was looking at those, highlighting the sort of humor in the idea that the paper used handling time, and they thought, something without hands to present that as handling time was a little bit interesting for a snake. But there's a lot of work that's been done on a handful of those populations where it seems like the snakes essentially are interacting in a non-negative way towards one another, so that they're aligning in a non-competitive way, but in a way that then creates almost a wall of snakes that the bats have to fly through to enter and exit the cave, non-competitively coexisting in that way. At least that was sort of the suggestion of the paper that they had referenced on the podcast, and I know that mention is made of that on Jeff and Michael's site as well. So there's a ton of interesting stuff. They're eating bats that have fallen on the floor. There was a record of one eating a mummified bat that was on the floor of the cave, and all sorts of interesting things.
Yeah, the fact that these can disperse where they're not competing with each other suggests that the food items are not a limited resource, that there's an abundance of them. And therefore there's a lack of competition as a result of that. And when we think about bat roosts and the emergence from bat roosts and the return to bat roosts, they tend to be very high densities of animals that are coming and going from those. And therefore, the likelihood that you're going to... I've seen videos of these, and they're just flailing around in the air. I don't know if you guys have seen it.
Yeah.
Their mouths are open and they're just flailing around in the air, hoping that one of them just bumps into them and then they go for it. It's kind of remarkable. There's an abundance of food items probably for a short period of time each year, and therefore they just take advantage of that.
Yeah, definitely. And they're not limited, just to be clear, they're not limited to that environment, but the densities and a lot of the study then, right, everyone It certainly helps if your study animal will present itself in the sort of density that gives you a high sample size. But they're not limited to that environment, but certainly the density in those areas, probably seasonally, as you point out, Warren, can be really high.
So in that case, I wonder, is there any seasonal change in their diet? Will they take advantage of bats whenever they are in high abundance and preferentially? And then once that abundance drops, will they then move to a different habitat to take advantage of rodents or lizards or birds or whatever? I wonder, do you see that change in their diet as the season progresses?
To me, I don't want to give a solid answer to that. I would say my impression from the literature was more that there are just sort of populations that exist within. So there's a cave population, so to speak, and then there are others, other populations. So as opposed to a singular population that's moving throughout the broader landscape that might imply, I think there are just a particularly high density in that. Where that resource is available, at least within sort of that limited time frame. But I'm sure, right, that then to the extent that is seasonally limited, that there would be movement into other environments. I just don't know what the carrying capacity in those other environments that don't have that necessarily have that same density, if that's going to support also the onboarding of those animals, or whether they sort of stay in their area even through the lean times, because there isn't the environment won't support the carrying capacity of the neighboring environments already is full with its own population.
Well, that's pretty interesting. I mean, if you look at killer whales, right, there's populations of killer whales that only know how to hunt seals. There's populations that know how to hunt salmon. There's populations that know how to hunt other whales. And it's pretty interesting to think that reptiles on an island like this could possibly have populations that are specialized bat feeders. Others are specialized rodent feeders. Others are specialized bird feeders, possibly. I'm not saying that's what's happening, but it's pretty interesting thought to think that they can fill a niche.
With that killer whale example, I think it was a couple of years ago, an author, I think it was Moran et al., they showed that those killer whales that were the mammal hunters versus the fish eaters versus transients were actually different species.
Really?
Yeah. So they sequenced, the original work was done on one or a couple of mitochondrial genes, and that suggested that they were all the same species. And then they sequenced the entire mitogenomes, and they showed them to be different species.
Wow.
If I'm correct. I think it was a couple of years ago since I read that paper, but that's a really cool example because they showed different traits in that the mammal hunters, whenever they're hunting, would go silent and they wouldn't speak to each other.
Right.
Whereas the fish eaters would be busy talking to each other because the fish couldn't hear them.
Right.
Really, really cool behaviors. But I see where you're getting at. What we should do, thinking about this right now, whenever the new book comes out, we should try and get Bob and Graham on to talk about these kind of interesting questions, because they probably have a lot more. Well, they do have a lot more experience in the field.
Yeah.
It'd be a nice way to kind of advance this kind of conversation.
Absolutely.
In time.
That would be great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 100%. Do you guys think we're good to transition into breeding on these?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, cool. In general, based on the conditions that I offer, right, so with a strong seasonality like we spoke of, where the ambient temperature in the room will be kind of a nighttime low in the mid-60s in the middle of winter, which obviously then is going to be associated with it being more dry than it already is here. But and then in midsummer, we're talking a ambient low temperature in the upper 70s to low 80s, just based on the conditions in my room. I pair them in April and May, so we're starting to get some of that warm up. Copulation is frequently observed both at night and occasionally during the day. I'll see the sort of tails sticking out, intertwined. in general, babies are born the end of August through mid-September on that time frame. So we're seeing a post-ovulation shed in the end of May, beginning of June, that then puts us into birth in either late August or early to mid-September. A wild telemetry study on Puerto Rican boas found an increase in male movement in the wild between April and June, with a peak in female movement in July, potentially on that end the authors speculated due to increased foraging for food at that time to substantiate that. Mature males of both species will combat one another, and utilization of multiple males can be helpful to promote breeding. Males, when they're introduced, will musk and constrict one another. In Jamaican boas, these interactions have been lethal in captivity on several occasions. Particularly in Puerto Rican boas, it's common to see males wrap females around the vent, so they'll be locked up, and then they'll wrap themselves around females, either singularly or in a mating ball with multiple males, as is both those visualizations are pretty common in the closely related anacondas. But yeah, it gives that same presentation locked up, and you have this male that appears much smaller, whether it is or actually isn't. The presentation of it is sort of the singular female sitting there within this male locked up, and then in ribbons around the vent.
Have you used multiple males?
Prospective partners.
I'm sorry, Rob. Have you used multiple males?
I have not. I put in sheds. I put in sheds from other males, but I haven't found it to be necessary.
Gotcha.
So yeah, I've produced both of these species without utilizing multiple males. I think we've talked about it before, right, Keith? That in general, I do think in captivity, we as reptile keepers in general, to the extent that we want to be record keepers as well, or to be able to present this is clearly the sire of this litter, and to have that, be a singular animal in the context of a particular litter, right, rather than a multiple paternity sort of situation. I do think in general we produce less animals overall based on that desire to be able to say these are the parents. Right. Makes us have less animals about which to say that, because I do think in the wild context, probably for both these species, based on particularly Puerto Rican boas, that we're talking about animals that occur in densities where they are going to be exposed to one another. And so the sort of concept of multiple males being involved in a singular reproductive event is probably something that we're seeing. And as induced populators, right, we can be in a space where some of these species might the active copulation for a particular length of time or number of times might be influencing whether we actually get ovulation at all. So, as I say, kind of the big picture view, the desire to be able to say this is a sire makes it so that we have less offspring about which to ascribe that label.
Right.
Let's see. Cannibalism of prospective partners has been seen in Jamaican boas, with instances of both males and females being the one consuming the other. And Tom Crutchfield did have an observation that he posted on Facebook a couple of years back of two mature females that were fighting during the breeding season in terms of biting and constricting one another. Though, given the context that he presents them, it's not entirely clear whether that was maybe a feeding response or a feeding reflex response associated with a wild mouse being in the enclosure, or whether that was antagonism associated with the breeding season. I don't think it's totally clear.
Did he have
interesting nonetheless? And I think
did he have males in the cage also, Rob? I didn't remember seeing that.
I don't remember if there were males. If there was a male in there at that time or not. I know that my understanding was that the females were maintained together for several years, and that this it wasn't as though an introduction of those particular animals. And that's why we're in the space of Was it response to a stimuli, an external stimuli, or was it if a male was introduced, if then it was antagonism associated with the reproductive cycle? I don't know, unclear, but yeah, it was interesting in that they were very large animals and that they had been maintained together for a long time.
Right.
As I may have said previously, the general duration that I've seen from post-ovulation shed to birth is 105 to 110 days. In my experience, potentially contrasted with the study on wild Inornatus that I had mentioned previously, where the females were foraging in July, my females, in general, stopped demonstrating nocturnal hunting behaviors and refused food after the post-ovulation shed. So they, in my experience, they expressed no inclination to feed, both behaviorally and if presented with an item after that shed until they've given birth.
Interesting.
One interesting bit I know you know about, Keith, the Jamaican boa litter from 2021. I saw an interesting thing where I think so. There's a lot here, so jump in wherever you want. But I think in terms of animals that are singularly paired, so going against what we were talking about utilizing multiple males in one, either with multiple females or exposure to the same female, we talked about seeing alignment of shed cycles in animals that are only paired with one another. And I saw that in that Jamaican boa litter where she appeared to ovulate in May, and I expected a post-ovulation shed in the middle of the third week of May, and the male went opaque, and that had been solely paired with her. So they had both shed before being put together. That wasn't the basis for when I put them together. Instead, it sort of aligned with the cycle of the room. They both had shed kind of well in advance of that. Paired them together. The male went opaque. I pulled him out. The female appeared to ovulate while the male was opaque. The female did not go opaque and didn't shed post-ovulation until July 4th. So roughly 50 days, 45 days after I would have anticipated it. So that the female dropped her litter only 65 days after her shed. As I say, the standard presentation being 105 to 110 days, but the male shed May 25th, so that if you utilize the date that he had shed, which is when I anticipated she would have shed based on when I noticed ovulation, then the babies would have been birthed on day 105 after his shed.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's crazy.
Yeah, so super interesting. I don't know why so in that litter she had 17 babies. It was not like her, sometimes, right, when you don't get that shed that you would anticipate. I know this happens more in the python context. The thought is that it's either a smaller ovulation or an ovulation associated with immature follicles. So you tend to see slugs associated with sheds that are mistimed. But yeah, she had a perfect litter of 17 live babies with no slugs or stillborns. Which was interesting in light of the fact that the ovulation was not, I guess, big enough to trigger that shed event.
Right. Yeah, that is interesting.
The babies generally are born opaque, particularly this last Puerto Rican boa litter I had. They were all deeply opaque when they were born, but they don't shed on birth, as is seen with Solomon Island tree boas and others, where within that first day they're shedding. Sort of a standard shed presentation if you start, from that date of being born, so that they're shedding 5 to 10 days after they're being born, after birth.
Mm.
In my experience, female Puerto Rican boas will generally readily in the days immediately after they give birth. I'll offer them, a small mouse either the day after or one day later than that, and generally get a great response out of that. The female subflavus didn't, in contrast, when she bred in 2021, didn't feed until after she had shed, which was approximately 3 weeks after she gave birth.
Now, I think you've had pretty good litters, so maybe you haven't seen this, but have you seen either species either eat unfertilized ova or stillborn babies?
So I only have one litter of experience with the Jamaican Boas, and that one, as I say, did not have any evidence of either slugs or stillborns that I saw. I guess the answer, and I think I saw them pretty quickly relative to when they were born. So I don't think in that context that I have the experience to speak of. But in terms of Puerto Ricans, I have found them previously with both slugs and stillborns, certainly slugs that were still in there, so they hadn't been consumed at that time, but I believe there's literature on them consuming that in the standard kind of boa presentation where they will, some of them at least will eat those, particularly slugs. In general, the litter size on Jamaicans is an average of 18, so relatively high, with a range of 2 to 34. And I know Tom recently has had a couple that have been towards that high end, right? And I think either the most recent one or a couple of years back, I think he had something like 33 or 34 live babies and a handful of stillborn, 3 or 4 stillborns and a handful of slugs in addition to that. So, I mean, I think that's a female that's in her teens. And so the carrying capacity, right, of that is just overwhelming relative to the first litter from the female's first litter that I had of 17, right? So we're talking double that in terms of live babies. And then in addition to that, having slugs and stillborns as well. The babies that from my litter were 10 to 13 inches long and weighed about an average of 13 grams.
This next point here that you have down, I know is of great interest. Yeah,
100%. Let me give the stats on the Inornatus litters, and then we'll talk about feeding these guys. So the litter size range for Inornatus is 12 to 37. My litters have been 13 or 14, with babies that are 14 to 15 inches long and approximately 15 grams. So I guess the relative mass is probably similar between the litter of Jamaican Boas and the litters that I've had of Inornatus, but kind of in the context of saying more smaller babies on that one subflatus litter, where I've had really high consistency on the Inornatus, where each time it's been 13 or 14. I think the 13, I also had a slug, so that each time it's basically been 14, 14 offspring or 14, potential, 14 follicles probably is what we're dealing with in all of those instances. So the baby Puerto Ricans, with there being fewer of them per litter, they have been just slightly but noticeably larger than I saw in the Jamaican Boa litter.
Are they stouter in diameter also, or just in length?
Basically the same, but just longer, so that their then total weight is slightly up. But yeah, their proportionality is pretty similar, and that does bring us to this point. So both these species are eating, I think in the wild they're eating Anolis species. They definitely want to eat lizards when they're born. I don't remember whether this made the podcast or not, so maybe this is duplicative to a conversation we had before. But just in terms of, I think, an important consideration in terms of feeding species that eat lizards in the wild is that the diameter as a limiting factor on a snake's ability to feed, right? If we're feeding a tube to a tube, so to speak, that the diameter of the prey item is the limiting factor. An anole that's a medium brown anole, right? So that's maybe a snout to vent length of 2.5 or 3 inches. has approximately the same width as a newborn pinky mouse, so that the productive load of that food item on a 3-inch snout to vent length brown anole is astronomically higher, both in terms of overall weight, but also not being so much of the mass of a newborn pinky mouse, right, is fat and milk that are not digestible items for boas. The important thing to take care with is when we switch those feeders off of anoles and onto immature rodents, we need to make sure that we're upping the feeding schedule accordingly, so that if an animal is situated to take a medium-sized anole once a week, if we're switching it to pinky mice, we're going to have to be feeding those 2 or 3 times a week to give the same caloric value, particularly digestible caloric value, to a boa when we make that shift. So I definitely saw that in terms of the Jamaican boa litter. Those that I had transitioned, those that responded to being transitioned off of lizards onto pink mice, I was feeding them hot frozen thawed pink mice with chick fluff in deli cups. So I would cup them, leave them overnight with that item. And that's all kind of a lot relative to giving them either live mice in the container, which they all refused, or in their enclosure, I should say, which they all refused, or presenting them on hemostats. They weren't feeding in that way. So the stress burden of cupping them, feeding them, putting them with, the prep associated with getting that food item ready didn't have me situated to be doing that 2 or 3 times a week. So I tried initially, I was just offering that on the same schedule that I otherwise would have been feeding, these half-grown brown anoles, and it was to the animal's detriment. All of those that had been willing to accept mice initially then started to decline because presumably the caloric load of those once a week pink mice were not enough relative to their expectations associated with being fed weekly on medium anoles. Yeah. So I transitioned all of them back to anoles, which I know is mind-blowing to sort of from the hobby perspective, right? The goal is always to be feeding commercial rodents, but or in the sort of the way we've been raised, right? Sort of the ideology, the standard ideology from the 90s through the teens, if we frame it that way, was always only commercial rodents, and I saw that really didn't make sense in this context, and all of them then transitioned back to anoles, perked up associated with that, and those that had been unwilling to take those pink mice, defrosted pink mice in the cup methodology, those continued to do great the whole time, and now have transitioned to taking mice. But we're on a stage where I'm not giving sort of those very first newborn pinks, and I'm giving them, feeding them more frequently. Those, once they've transitioned off those items. Certainly, they're in the wild; they eat rodents. But I think it's one of those where, if we're going to try and force the issue of that transition sooner than they would be, than the schedule they would have in the wild, where probably they're not making that transition, if for nothing else than the sort of niche partitioning within the species, right? Where when you have species that the young eat different items than the adults, they're filling a different part of the environment, right? They're not competing with one another in the environment. I think when we have species that want to do that naturally in the wild, we need to be careful in captivity.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting things, observations on these species that you've brought to my attention, and it seems so clear now when I think about it. Yeah, I'm like, why didn't I think of that? I love that. I love that whole thought process there and how you got to the end on that. Yeah, that's great stuff. Yeah,
thanks. I mean, I wish I could claim to have, I wish I had thought of it rather than seeing it happen and having having it forced into me. But it definitely makes sense, and it really gives life to. I know that Jeff, for a long time, in the context of Turks and Caicos boas, the chrysogaster, views people's unwillingness to feed those lizards deep into their life, so several years into their life, as deleterious to the ability to keep those in captivity successfully, really at all. So that he's been more successful, particularly in terms of maintenance. I know he's still kind of trying to work through getting successful litters out of them. But he's had success keeping them well and keeping them in good condition for longer because of that willingness to feed them lizards, even at a year or 2 or 3 years old. And I didn't necessarily put together what the basis for that would be, but I think the experience associated with feeding these subflavus, it really drove home that, well, it's because the mass of prey that they can consume on a lizard body type is just so drastically different than on a rodent body type.
Yeah, Jeff has actually mentioned to me also, I was looking at banana boas, and he mentioned to me the same thing with those, that they just, even if you can get them switched over to mice, they just don't seem to fare as well or have a longevity in captivity like if you keep them on lizards.
Yeah, and I mean, well, there certainly could be nutritional aspects to that, right? Depending on the source, right? And there, in terms of if you're feeding wild Florida anoles to these, obviously the macronutrients and things that are within that prey item are going to be different from a 1 day old commercial rodent. But even beyond that, I was kind of like trying and failing prior to this to contextualize what that difference would be, and maybe that would be enough. But if we're talking about things that are willing to eat them, well, what's the difference? And the answer is, if we're feeding them those commercial rodents, then to get the mass into them that we need, you're either going to be feeding a larger item that then is going to be this really dense food bolus, and maybe their physiology isn't designed to break that down efficiently relative to the density of that mass. So maybe we're getting some like rot rather than digestion. That might be part of it, so that the lizard is, by being more dispersed, maybe it's digesting more. The system is designed to digest that in such a way that it isn't capable of dealing with this inch-long but same diameter. Essentially, right? The mass being the mass of the lizard is probably dispersed 3 or 4 times what the mass is, how it's distributed in that pink mouth.
Yeah, lots to think about.
So maybe it's that we're getting, I don't know if it's, but certainly the proof is in the pudding in terms of those negative impacts. Yeah, with Ungaleophis, as you talk about, with Chrysogaster, maybe that's part of the thing with Grenadensis, right, in terms of their very slow metabolism. And that maybe got us in that same spot where, if we're talking about essentially obligate, in the context of Grenadensis, obligate feeders on sleeping anoles, right? So we're very much a particular niche on that, if we're then giving them something so drastically different in terms of the density and size, that maybe they're just not digesting it efficiently, and that's part of the lack of metabolic growth, kind of the expression of metabolic growth. I don't know. Definitely something that I've seen. Yeah. Should we transition into availability of the species in captivity?
Absolutely.
So, as we mentioned, awesome. As we mentioned in passing before, both of these species are Endangered Species Act listed in the United States. The populations in Europe, I believe, essentially what we see with these is that there's a European population. Some of those animals have been brought into the United States, but it's difficult to, and they're relatively available, I believe, in Europe, and sort of without legal restriction, at least amongst EU countries. Here in the United States, you can't import them as an Endangered Species Act listed species. You can't import them for commercial purposes, and you can't engage in interstate, so amongst different state transport for commercial purposes. As endangered rather than threatened, they're in a different space. Both species are in a different space than are things like indigos, where you can get a commercial permit because those are only threatened. Eastern indigos. There is not that permit, although there has been a shift of late to move Puerto Rican boas to that space because whether it's a function of a greater understanding of the population in the wild to see that they're not as the population is not as at risk as was perceived when they were listed, or they've become more numerous since the 70s when they were listed, and the success with this species in captivity amongst aficionados, even in a non-commercial space, have kind of brought Fish and Wildlife to realize that, we're probably not looking at the risk of smuggling these for commercial purposes, right? Both the population is doing better than was thought, and there's a healthy captive population of those, of the Puerto Rican boas in particular. To that point, there was a 2018 study on the genetic diversity of Puerto Rican boas in U.S. captive collections, both private collections and several zoo collections, that concluded that Puerto Rican boas in captivity in the United States exhibited a high degree of genetic diversity relative to wild populations. They identified in the genetic sampling at least 13 founder females and a sizable number of males that are evidenced in the population we have now. So they can work backwards to identify that. The study concluded the population is more diverse than expected, and the captive population overall retains a higher than expected number of haplotypes and relatively low signature of loss of heterozygosity. So the upshot of that is, despite the fact that these have not been amenable to commercial trade in the United States for 40 to 50 years, the small population of people that really like Puerto Rican boas have done a really great job at sort of gifting animals back and forth, and just making sure that people who have an interest in these have the ability to work with them, and they've done really well to manage that population. So the study found that genetically speaking, in terms of diversity, the captive population was far exceeded their expectations.
Where do we stand with the Jamaican boas on that front?
So unfortunately, there hasn't been an equivalent study done at this point. I know Jeff has, certainly encouraged that. I think everyone would be interested in what those results are, but we don't have them at this point.
Okay.
Maybe Warren can help us.
So was there not a study on Jamaican boas at one point on genetic diversity? Who was the author of the one that you were talking about?
I don't know. It was out of UNC. I think it was. I'll have to pull it up.
So there was a paper by Athanasia Zika. She actually co-authored a paper with her a number of years ago, where they looked at genetic structure of Jamaican boas. And I'm going to see if I can pull up what the results were of that there. In fact, I had a paper with her and with Graham Reynolds at the same time. It was a paper on Colombian rainbow boas. But if I can find, you talk among yourselves, and I will check this out, and I'll report back in a second. There was a paper on Jamaican boas, and I can dig it up.
That'd be interesting.
Yeah, so there is a paper. It was published in Molecular Ecology, a very good journal, in 2008 on subflavus, and they looked at both mitochondrial and nuclear genetic diversity. They used 87 individuals that were wild-born and captured opportunistically over a period of 3 decades. I'm just trying to find. They found I think, pretty significant or decent genetic differentiation. And yeah, across the island, in fact, they found relatively strong levels of genetic differentiation. So the eastern separated, there was like an eastern and then a central and then a western group that were somewhat combined but showed separate genetic patterns of genetic structure. Genetically quite diverse. So at least in the wild, they show moderate to high levels of genetic diversity, despite being a species that was on the verge of being extirpated at a point.
Right.
So that there's still quite a bit of genetic diversity. Now, what we have in captivity, I don't know. I don't know the origins of all of the captive animals or how many really have been the source for the animals that we now see in captivity. I know that Tom has had a decent group of them and has had success with them. I don't know how his compare to Jeff's and so on in terms of their origin, however. But that would be an interesting thing to look at. And you know what?
Yeah.
I might have samples in a box. I know that Jeff has sent me like an enormous box of shed skins a number of years ago that had everything from different Sanzinia through all of the Corrales and I think into the Chalabothrath as well. It's just finding time to do it is the issue. Now that I'm in a position where I'm only teaching one course every year instead of 6 courses a year, that's going to give me a lot more opportunity to dig into those and play with them. So, watch this space. We'll see what happens.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think I know he's been super keen. So the author on the Inornatus paper was, and I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but Angst, Aungst, in 2018. That was the Department of Biology at UNC, where they had looked at the captive, diversity within the captive population in Puerto Rican boas. And I know he's hopeful that to do the same for subflavus, because it would be super interesting, as Keith was saying.
So was it published in a scientific paper, or was it like a master's thesis, or what does it say? Is like, conservation biology or conservation genetics, or?
I'm looking at the reference on Jeff and Michael's page. So
okay.
Let me scroll down and see. Certainly not the level that you referenced there. Journal of Undergraduate Research, presumably at UNC.
Because studies of captive diversity can somewhat be difficult to publish, but I would have thought that would have went to somewhere like zoo biology or something, conservation genetics. But yeah, it depends on how you pitch it. But I think what it suggests, at least if the samples of subflavus that came out of the wild are distributed across the island and were sourced from disparate parts across the island, then there should be a decent level of genetic diversity in the captive population, I would hope. And hopefully people are swapping animals between each other to find genetically diverse kind of breedings. So that would be interesting to look at.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Certainly. I mean, that's what we've seen with the Inornatus,
Yeah, I can tell you with the Jamaican boas, I had gotten the male from Jeff first, and he didn't have an unrelated female for me. The following year, I got the female from Tom. I ran it by Jeff, and Jeff said if I'm getting it from Tom, it's unrelated to his stock. So,
yeah, I mean, in a non-commercial species, right, particularly in the interstate context, it really is. It is all about joy within the project and things. So, it's not about, I need to get a pair of these and start producing them. I just want to work with these animals, whether it's a singular animal or then down the road trying to produce some, trying to make those the most effective that we can for the U.S. captive population of these species.
Yeah, it's a labor of love for sure.
Awesome. Well, in the absence of any other points that you guys think we should have made and have not yet made, I guess you can do our closing, Keith.
All right. A great show, by the way, guys. I really enjoyed this one. It was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. So thank you for that.
I think is that I now want to have these as well. I don't know if I need to hear these kind of discussions going on. I know I want to get Jamaicans, Puerto Rican Boas.
All right. Well, I want to thank you all for listening to Boas with Warren, Rob, and myself. Please check out the NPR networks or the YouTube channel and the website at moralipythonradio.com. You can follow us on most podcast apps, including iTunes and Spotify. And we hope you listen to next month's episode of Boas, where we'll be talking about Madagascan boas. Until then, enjoy your animals and follow your passions, guys.